This week is week 2 of histology. So we're going to continue the tissues, muscle and nervous, and then we're going to look at our first major organ system, the integumentary system, the major organ of which is the skin. So we'll be looking at a slide of the skin as well. Starting with muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is very tightly packed tissue with little matrix in between. So you're not going to see a lot of spaces where you would find like tissue fluid, the ground substance. You're also not going to see collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Those were in connective tissue only. But sometimes you'll hear muscle fiber. That really is not the best way to refer to a muscle cell, but specifically it refers to a skeletal muscle cell, not collagen, elastic, or reticular. So these fibers, if you call them fibers, these are alive. And skeletal muscle cells are called fibers because they are really long. So this is often referred to as a muscle fiber. I would prefer skeletal muscle cell. I think that's easier and keeps you from getting confused with collagen, elastic, and reticular. Now, the function of muscle tissue, these cells are specialized to contract, and that contraction produces movement. And that movement, as a result, produces heat. So the cells are specialized, they contract, and that contraction produces movement, whether it's movement under your conscious control or not. And then as a byproduct, produces heat. We have 3 types of muscle, We have 3 types of muscle. Skeletal is the one you most often think of. But the heart is a muscle, and then we have smooth muscle in some of our hollow organs, like our stomach. Skeletal muscle first. The cells, these are the ones that are sometimes called fibers, but skeletal muscle cell is fine. These are striated. They have stripes. And most likely you'll learn what those stripes are in lecture, but they're basically the lining up of the proteins that produce the movement in a muscle cell. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate, so you will oftentimes see multiple nuclei scattered around. If this muscle cell has 6 nuclei, it's because it used to be 6 separate cells that then fuse together. So that's why skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate. They're multiple cells fused together. Now, this is the only muscle that is voluntary. You consciously control it. So the location, we're just going to say attached to bones. This is the muscle you most often think of. And most of these muscles are attached to bones. There's a few exceptions, but most of the skeletal muscles are attached to bones. This is what the slide is going to look like. You're going to see a longitudinal section like this right here. That's what you want to focus on, not the cross sections. So these are the skeletal muscle cells. You can see lots of nuclei, the dark purple spots. And if you look really closely, you'll see stripes. Those are the striations in a skeletal muscle cell. Our second muscle type is cardiac muscle. It's found only in the heart. This is an involuntary muscle. You cannot sit there and think about making your heart beat faster or slower. I mean, you can sit there and close your eyes and find your happy place and slow your breathing and meditate, and that can slow your heart rate down. Or you can sit there and get anxious and think about something that bothers you, and that can actually speed up your heart rate. But you can't just say, I'm going to have my heart beat at 75 beats per minute right now. The cells are striated, but they're also branched. So they're a little bit different than skeletal muscle cells. They are still striped, but they have branches in them, and skeletal muscle cells do not. Now, where the cardiac muscle cells connect to another cardiac muscle cell you will find an intercalated disc. An intercalated disc is going to look like a darker stripe on the slide. These are junctions between adjoining cells so that the message to contract can pass very quickly from one to the next. So like this, when this muscle cell contracts, it's going to tell 3 others to contract. So what you're seeing are those junctions, and they're called intercalated discs. So if we look at a slide, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's a couple I have the arrows pointing to, there's one, there's one. You can see the subtler stripes, the striations, but the darker, thicker ones are the intercalated discs. And we're back to 1 nucleus per cell for the most part. If you see a cardiac muscle cell and it has 2 nuclei, that is okay. Some of them do, but the majority of them are 1 nucleus per cell. Last, we have smooth muscle. For the location, we're going to say lining, hollow organs. So some examples, we have the stomach, we have the intestines, we have the bladder, we have the uterus, the inside lining of blood vessels. So lining hollow organs is what we're going to say. And this is another involuntary muscle. So you cannot consciously tell your stomach to contract and mix the food that you just ate. Now these cells are spindle shaped, which means they are pinched at the ends and wider in the middle. They almost look like squamous cells, but they're much bigger. And they're called smooth because they are not striated. So they're non-striated cells, look kind of like this. And this is what the slide is going to look like. Now there are 2 areas on the slide. One will look like this, and that's what you want to look at. The other one will be cross-section, and all you'll see are all these circles because you've cut the muscle in a different direction. So you do not want that. You want it to look like this. And we have, again, 1 nucleus per cell and no striations. Our last tissue is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, there's only 1 slide to look at. Now, nervous tissue has 2 major cell types. The neurons are the large star-shaped cells that transmit electrochemical messages. The smaller cells are called neuroglia, or sometimes just glia. Glia means glue. And their function is to support the neurons and the nervous tissue. Now we have nervous tissue in the brain, spinal cord, and then in some of our sensory organs and in nerves. But our 2 main locations are the brain, and the spinal cord. There we go. So the parts of a neuron, I do want you to know, this is going to come in handy a little bit later on in this semester. A neuron kind of looks like this. There's a nucleus, there's an axon, and then there are dendrites that branch. Sometimes there's just one, but this is what a typical neuron looks like. The soma is the cell body. Somatic means body. So the soma is this portion here. Over here you'll notice they called it neurosoma. This picture comes from your textbook. Just soma is fine. The axon is a single process. Sometimes you can tell which one it is, sometimes you can't. I'm going to show you that on the next slide. And then the dendrites are these little projections here. And basically, information comes in through the dendrites and goes out through an axon. So this is the flow of information through a neuron. So this is what our slide looks like. This big one is just 1 neuron. There is its nucleus right there. Now it has all these processes coming out, lots of processes, but you don't know which one is the axon. So what I want you to know is that a typical neuron has only one axon. The rest of these processes are going to be dendrites. And then all these little spots are the neuroglia, the glial cells. So that's nervous tissue. Our next topic is the integumentary system. So we just finished talking about tissues. Tissues are two or more types of cells with a common function. You put two or more types of tissues with a common function together and you get an organ. Put organs, multiple organs together and you get an organ system. The main organ of the integumentary system is the skin. Accessory organs, we have glands, hair, and nails. So put all these organs together and you get the integumentary system. Now, one thing that tends to throw people, the skin is just the epidermis and dermis. There is another layer called the hypodermis that is under the dermis. Hypo means below. That layer is not technically part of the skin, it's just part of the integumentary system. So the skin can also be called the integument, can also be called the cutaneous membrane. The skin is composed of these two layers, the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is keratinized stratified squamous. And that is one of the longest things you'll have to write on the first exam. Keratinized stratified squamous. That's what the epidermis is composed of. And that's a type of epithelium. We did epithelial tissues last week. We mainly focused on non-keratinized stratified squamous. That's probably the longest thing you'll have to write. The dermis then is two separate layers. The more superficial layer is called the papillary layer. That's its name. Its tissue type is areolar. The deeper layer is called the reticular layer. That's its name, but its tissue type is dense irregular. And what you'll see is that the dermis is about 20% papillary, 80% reticular. So I'll show you that in a picture of a slide in just a minute. Then, separate from the skin, we have the hypodermis, also known as your subcutaneous fat. Around a lot of the body, it's adipose, and it's often mixed with areolar. In some places, it is just areolar, like your eyelids, which are your thinnest skin. You don't need adipose on your eyelids, so that hypodermis is areolar. But for the most part, over most of the body, it's kind of a mixture. So here's the epidermis, this layer here, and you can see it looks like it's multiple layers, and it is because it's stratified squamous. Plus, it's keratinized. The outer layers have keratin in them. The inner layers are starting to make keratin. So we'll talk about the layers of the epidermis. But as a whole, it is keratinized stratified squamous. Then this is the dermis. And then all this out here is the hypodermis. So skin is only epidermis and dermis. The hypodermis is below. And these big things that you're seeing, these are sweat glands. So like that big cluster of cell is a sweat gland. Now when we blow up the picture and get closer, we can see that the dermis has two distinct types of tissue. It's subtle, but this is the papillary layer. A papilla is a bump. And specifically, these are the bumps that give you fingerprints and toe prints. So it's a bumpy layer called the papillary layer. The tissue type is areolar. The reticular layer is the other 80% of the dermis, and that is dense irregular connective tissue. And again, this is a big sweat gland. We're going to start talking about the epidermis. There are a number of different types of cells, which you need multiple types of cells to make up a tissue. Stem cells sit right on the basement membrane, and when they divide, you get another stem cell and a keratinocyte. So stem cells are unique because they have the ability to become different types of cells. In this case, when a stem cell divides, you get another stem cell and you get a keratinocyte. Stem cells are going to stay on the basement membrane, while the keratinocytes are going to migrate through the layers of the epidermis towards the top. Keratinocytes produce keratin, and keratin functions to strengthen the skin, hair, and nails. They all have keratin in them. The other type of cell we have are melanocytes. Melanocytes produce melanin. This is the pigment of your skin. Now, we all have about the same number of melanocytes, but the melanocytes can produce different amounts of melanin. So that's why we see all the different skin tones that we have. So yes, melanin is the pigment, but the function of the pigment is to protect against UV radiation. That is its function. Now, the epidermis is divided into multiple strata. Strata means layers. So the stratum basal is the basal layer. This is the layer attached to the basement membrane. It contains melanocytes and stem cells, and it is the site of cell division. And it stays by the basement membrane because, if you remember, epithelial tissues do not have blood running through them. So the cells that need access to the blood supply are going to sit as close to it as possible. And that's going to be right on top of the connective tissues. The cells, excuse me, that move up are the keratin cells, the keratinocytes. So the next layer is called the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum, in a lot of your skin, is the thickest layer. And this is where keratin production begins. So stratum spinosum, they named it that because the cells looked spiky, but what they discovered was that was only when the cells were dead and put on a slide. The keratin kind of spiked the cell membranes, but the name stuck. Stratum granulosum, you're going to see darker granules in these cells, and what they're doing is they're binding up the keratin into bundles, and they're helping to waterproof the cell. So here's a cell of the stratum granulosum. They are going to have granules in them, and what those granules will do is bind up the keratin, which again is the protein that makes hair, skin, and nails stronger, and then other ones will release kind of like a waxy layer that will make the cell membrane impermeable, and so the cells die. Impermeable means nothing gets through. Now, you should have learned in lecture when you talked about cells that cells are semi-permeable. Some things get through, some things don't. Impermeable means nothing gets through. And so if the cells can't get oxygen or nutrients, they're going to die. And that's what they're supposed to do because they're going to form the epidermal water barrier. And then in thick skin, we have a fourth layer called the stratum lucidum. This is only found palms of your hands, soles of your feet. So if you think about the skin over your arm, for example, or your forearm, doesn't have a stratum lucidum. So it's not going to be as thick as the palms of your hands or the soles of your feet. And then the outermost layer is the stratum corneum. In thick skin, this is the thickest layer. The rest of your skin, the stratum spinosum, is the thickest layer. It can be between 2 and 10 layers of cells, while the stratum corneum can be up to 30 layers. This is the layer that you see when you look at your skin. And it's dead. These are both dead. So this is what our slide looks like. The only two layers, there's only two strata I'm going to have you label on a slide, is the stratum basal, the layer right on top of the basement membrane, and then this is the stratum corneum. A lot of people call it the bacon layer because that's kind of what it looks like. The cells are supposed to be stuck together, but they've spread out a little bit over the process of putting them on a slide. The other layers you should know on a model of the skin.